Part 18. As soon as they were out of sight, I slumped forward, arms shaking. Michael lifted me like I was an empty sack and gently sat me down on the chair. "It's not safe to pick pride over pain," he chuckled, and I shrugged. Ow, that hurt too. My arms flopped in my lap, the strength sucked right out of them. "If you're planning on getting into that pool, I suggest you rest until they get back." I nodded and looked up at his massive form. "Have you met this physical therapist?" He nodded. I had to meet with her during the background check and explain the security protocol to her this morning. "Well?" He shrugged. "She is nice enough. Smart, I guess." My brows rose and I smiled. "Is she cute?" He took a split second too long to answer, then shrugged. "I didn't notice. She's new to the manor, and I have to treat everyone new as a possible threat." "That makes asking her out a little hard," I giggled. Michael shook his head and started to wheel me out of the room. "Like I said, everyone is a possible threat. Your safety is my number one priority." I rolled my eyes and then moaned. Even that hurt. As soon as we got into the hallway, we saw Track heading our way. He shook his head at me. "Sneaking out on me already?" I shrugged. "You needed your sleep, and I had the chance to get out of that room." He nodded and looked around, obviously noticing that Jonathan wasn't with me. I filled him in on the water exercise and the physical therapist. When I explained about her, his frown deepened. "Your dad set this up?" he asked, with a worried tone. I nodded slowly, watching him. He looked around the hallway. "Okay, then. I'll meet you at the pool. Jackson and Rock called. They'll be here in a few minutes, so they can help too." "I am not that breakable, you know," I sighed, and heard the whining in my own voice. He grinned and nodded. "I completely agree, but you're stronger than a herd of elephants when you shift." Oh, so that's what he meant. I nodded slowly, still trying not to think of the damage I had inflicted over the last few weeks. Track and Jonathan weren't the only ones that had to heal from my crazed shifts. "Should I go get you one of those blow-up floats with a hippo on the front?" he asked teasingly. "Don't you dare," I growled, and he shrugged. "Okay, so maybe a swan. Or a duck." I grunted, and he laughed. "Okay, we'll meet you in the pool." He went to turn, heading away from the hall that led to the pool. "Where are you going?" I asked. "To see a man about a hybrid," he called over his shoulder as he trotted, pulling his cell phone out of his back pocket as he went. He and I must watch way too many movies together, because I laughed and let Michael push me towards the other end of the manor. By the time the maid had helped me into a one-piece suit, my body was ready to call it a day and go back to bed. But I wasn't missing out on this chance, so I grit my teeth as Michael wheeled me out into the pool area. So much for just needing 4 people. There were 8 people waiting. My dad, a doctor, and a male nurse were dressed in regular clothes. Track, Jonathan, Rock, and Jackson were in swim trunks. The strange female was obviously the physical therapist. Her blue one-piece swimsuit screamed business, not pleasure, and Michael didn't instantly call out the guards. She looked about an inch or so shorter than me, but she was built strong. Her blonde hair was put back in a ponytail, and she was talking to the doctor when Michael pushed me towards them. I glanced into the pool and was glad to see a blue float board and a plain black round tube. No cartoon animal heads. There was also something that looked like a blow-up lounge chair. It had a high back that was tilted, armrests, and a small seat. I smiled. I was definitely trying that one out. Michael stopped my chair in front of the group, and my dad knelt in front of me. "No being a tough girl, Reina," he whispered, giving me the look again. You are not to push yourself too far, understand? When I nodded, he turned and the female walked over and squatted next to him. She seemed pretty, but her face was too serious. Reina, this is Paige, your physical therapist. I nodded. Hello. She smiled, and it seemed genuine and even reached her eyes. Hello, Reina. My dad stood and I looked up at him. You're just going to be relaxing in the water today, he stated, looking at her and then at me. Give your body a reprieve from being in that bed. I saw his jaw clench and bit my lower lip. This was hard on him, and I wouldn't argue. Paige nodded. The water will relieve all the pressure, like floating. I nodded back, then I inhaled slowly and knew she was what she claimed to be. Michael would have checked and triple-checked, but I liked relying on my nose. I bent my neck back and looked up at Michael. Are you going to get in some trunks? He grinned down at me and shook his head. I'm playing lifeguard. When I turned back around, Jonathan stepped up. Track, Rock, and Jackson hopped into the pool at the shallow end. Michael pushed my chair down to that end and then set the brakes. Jonathan scooped me up and walked carefully down the steps. I gasped as the water hit me, and he quickly went back up the steps, his eyes turning to me. It's fine, I stated quietly, seeing the guys swim over quickly. Just not used to actually feeling it like that. Like what? We all turned as Paige stepped up. Well, I said, trying to find the right words. As a vampire, I had an awareness of the temperature, but it never really affected me. As a wolf, and most of the time in between, I can actually feel temperatures. Is the water too cold? Jonathan asked, his voice and eyes worried. Not at all, I smiled, dropping my arm so that my fingers touched the surface. I'm still just getting used to really feeling it. He nodded slowly and Track moved back a step as Jonathan walked back into the water with me. Paige had Rock bring over the lounge-type chair and they placed me in it. It was painful getting situated, but once I was in, I laid my head back and smiled. This is nice, I moaned quietly. Paige was in front of me and smiled. Good, just relax. I'm going to start rubbing your legs just to help your muscles. I nodded, and she reached under the water and gently started to massage my calf. It hurt and felt good at the same time. Jonathan looked at me and I winked to let him know I was doing fine. Next, I was put in the black tube. It was nice to have all the pressure off my body, and I floated there, with my arms over the edge, and watched Jackson and Rock start a water fight with large squirt guns. I laughed and ran my toes over the bottom of the pool. I was not allowed out of the shallow end, and they also kept me near the stairs. Track swam over and handed me a small water gun. How you holding up? Good, I said honestly. My body was tired, but it felt so incredibly good not to be sitting or laying. Paige was standing near me, up to her waist in the water, and Jonathan was between me and the deeper part of the pool. I liked that she didn't hover, and that, after the leg massage, she simply let me float. I uncorked the stopper and dunked the water gun. Track smiled and turned to the guys, pretending not to notice. I had seen the flash of blue plastic tucked into the back of his swim trunks. When I placed the stopper back in, I looked at Jonathan, who raised one brow. I wiggled mine and lifted the toy, pointing it at him. Then I quickly turned and squirted Track just as he was pulling his out. I caught him right in the mouth, and he choked and spit out the water, but aimed his at me and fired. I squealed and lowered my head, still holding the trigger on mine, though I was aiming blind now. When the assault ended, I looked up, and he was refilling his. I quickly followed suit, but Jonathan waded over to me. Careful, Jonathan, I teased. Would you really shoot an unarmed man? He chuckled, holding out his empty hands. I lifted my toy and aimed, but as I pulled the trigger, he went under the water. I huffed and turned to Track, who was ready and got me first. I spit out the water and then shook my head. I want a bigger gun. I kicked my feet a little. In this position, I could touch the bottom with my tiptoes and spun around. The plastic shelves and crates that held the water toys were on the far end. I eyed it and then looked down at my small weapon. Jonathan surfaced directly in front of me, and I gasped and then laughed. I pushed up with my forearms to see over him. "Dad, will you get me?" was as far as I got, and then I cried out. Everything happened so fast then. The pain crashed down on me, and I felt hands grabbing me. "Don't hurt them. Please don't hurt them," I remembered thinking. I screamed again as my body tore itself apart from the inside out. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard a voice, but I couldn't focus on it. The pain lit me on fire and sucked the air out of me. I heard things snap, and still that voice was there, somewhere. In the midst of the self-torture, it drifted through my mind. I couldn't understand the words. The sensation of hearing it, while my body begged for death, was odd. It was like a small pinpoint of light in a wild hurricane, or at least that's the only way I could think about it afterwards. I struggled to stay conscious, though part of me hoped I would die this time, completely. The pain seared. It burned hotter than anything I could imagine. But that sound, that voice pulled my focus. When I tried to listen, the pain seemed to get pushed back some. It didn't lessen, but I noticed it just a fraction less than normal. Finally, the pain ebbed and then was gone. As usual, the pain was quickly forgotten, and I stood on my wobbling wolf legs and shook hard, throwing water everywhere. Chapter 12. Track was on his hands and knees in front of me, panting hard and his eyes smiling up at me. I whimpered a bit and then looked him over. His bare chest had a set of scratch marks over it, and I lowered my head and let out an apologetic whimper. He chuckled, still trying to catch his breath. "That was the best shift so far," he stated, and I lifted my head a little. Jonathan and my dad knelt in front of me, and I arched my neck towards my dad. I always needed some reassurance when I shifted to Wolf. My dad smiled at me, actually looking pleased. My tail betrayed me again and wagged hard behind me. I turned and glared at it, but then turned back when my dad called my name. Rock and Jackson trotted over, in wolf form, and I barked playfully at them. Then came the doctors. My ears went down, but I didn't move. I didn't like them. Jonathan talked to me as they drew my blood, checked my heart rate, flashed a light in my eyes, and a dozen other things they did every time I changed. When they finally stood and walked off to review their findings, I turned back to my dad. He was standing with a new female now, and they were talking. I tilted my head and watched them for a minute. Jonathan called my name, and I looked at him. He was still in his swim trunks, and I turned my head and looked at the pool. "Not a good idea," was all I heard as I turned and trotted over to the pool's edge. "Reina," Jonathan called behind me, but I pushed off and jumped into the water. I lifted my head up high as I hit, and I snorted the water out of my nose. My forelegs instinctively started to paddle, and I turned and I made my way to the steps. Once there, and with my feet solidly on the tiled stairs, I looked around. Jonathan and Track were walking over, and Jackson and Rock were next to them. Track stepped down into the water. "Not smart, Ray," he snapped at me, and my head dropped from the reprimand. "Gads, girl, you just shifted. You didn't know if you had the strength to do that," he growled at me. My head lowered more, and I whimpered, my tail now tucked between my legs. As good as that appendage was at expressing what I was feeling, it was also very demeaning at times. He sat on the step next to me, and I leaned forward and nudged his arm, still keeping my head down. No, he huffed, crossing his arms to avoid my touch. That was just stupid, Reina. Ouch, that hurt. I sat down, the water up to my chest, and looked away. He sighed, and the anger in his voice changed. You can't do things like that, not right after a shift. I didn't move, and he sighed again. You scared the crap out of us all. I turned and looked at the others around the pool. Great. Now I had guilt times 8. Paige smiled at me, though, and my ears perked up a little. Track turned and followed my gaze. Then Jonathan, who stood at the top of the stairs, gestured to me. I gave Track's arm another nudge, needing him not to be angry. He eyed me hard, but then stood, and we both stepped out of the pool. I shook hard again, and a maid walked briskly over with a large towel. Jonathan took it and dried me off a bit. Good thing I was covered in fur, or that would have been really embarrassing. Finally, Paige walked over. She kept her movements relaxed and casual. My ears were up when she reached me. When she knelt, she went down on all fours and then slowly sat back on her knees. I watched her, more out of curiosity than anything else. I looked up as Michael stepped up, watching me. He winked at me, and I sat down again to keep that dang tail from wagging. Then Paige leaned forward and was on all fours again. My head tilted as I watched her. I sensed the others coming closer, but there was no threat from them. She kept her eyes just to the side, and I reached my muzzle out and sniffed her. She stayed relaxed, and I stood up. Dang it, there went that tail again. It didn't wag hard, but it was up. She wasn't being submissive, but she was showing me she wasn't a threat. I took a step closer and sniffed her hair. I could smell the wolf in her. She wasn't pack, but still there was no threat. Finally, I sat back down and my tongue flopped out. Track scooted over to me and smiled, and I lunged playfully at him, stopping just in front of him and lowering my front paws. He held up his hands. You wiped me out changing. I don't have the energy. Give me a minute, he laughed. My dad smiled at me. I'm glad you have so much energy, in one form at least. I barked happily and then looked towards the door. Oh, outside, I thought. I wanted to go out in the back and run. I trotted over to the door and barked at it. Okay, thumbs would be really nice about now. Jonathan and Track were quickly at my side. Rock and Jackson trotted over, and I could tell they were hoping for the same thing. Do you think they'll let us? Rock asked, through images in my mind. It's worth a try, I barked, and we all looked up at the other two. Track shook his head, and we all turned, seeing my dad and Paige walking towards us, with Michael just behind them. She wants to go out and run, Track told them. Paige nodded. She's been cooped up a long time. No, my father said, avoiding my stare. The grounds are not that secure, and there are too many ways for her to get hurt. Or get out. My tail dropped. Guess not, Rock thought, and I looked at him and whined. Has she been able to run when she was in wolf form? Paige asked, looking at my dad. He shrugged. Well, no, but with all that she is going through, and it just doesn't seem safe. Did my dad just stutter? I looked at this female with new enthusiasm. If she were alpha enough, at least about my care, and she thought me running was a good idea, there was hope. Track shook his head. There is no way it's safe enough. Hey, I barked, and like my dad, he didn't look at me. The grounds are massive. There are 5 manicured acres and 15 wild, he argued. I felt my lip curl. He was supposed to be on my side. What's with him? Rock growled, and I looked at the massive wolf, the same expression on my face. Paige looked down at the 3 of us. If she has enough of her pack around her, she thought out loud, and my ears perked up, watching her hopefully. If she started to shift out there, Jonathan snapped, it would take us too long to get her back inside. And she would be too exposed, my dad stated. We have caught plenty of people trying to sneak to get a look at her. Really? I thought. I didn't know that. Rock, Jackson, and I looked back at Paige, our only ally at the moment. Paige gave a quick wink, then looked at my dad. I am sure your vampires are quick enough. You have maintenance vehicles for outside, correct? My dad gave a slow nod, his eyes tight and his jaws set. She was going to have to be good to get past that look. She shrugged. I can only do so much with water and indoor therapy. When she is a wolf, she can stretch and run. That will help her muscles in ways I can't inside. She eyed my dad, Track, and Jonathan, sizing up their facial expressions. Keeping her confined as a wolf might be one part of the problem, a small part, but she isn't able to use a wolf form like it needs to be used. I sat down and watched her. I just might like her. Rock chuckled and nuzzled my neck hard, making me have to shift my weight. I turned and nipped at him. Jackson laid down, afraid to make any move to stop this. My dad ran a hand through his hair. Yikes. He only did that when he was very stressed. I don't know, he stated, and I froze. Wow, maybe he was cracking. Jonathan shook his head quietly and Track threw out his arms. You can't be seriously considering this. If he were wearing long pants, I would yank on them to shut him up. I know how many they have caught on this side of the manor's grounds. They're getting inside, he snapped, looking at Michael, who nodded. Great. Michael was on his side, too. What if they're armed? Track spat, and that did it. My father's shoulders tensed and his head came up. We will find another way, inside. We can modify a treadmill, make it big enough for her to run on. I will not risk her going out there, period. Ugh, Track won. I growled at him and he looked down at me. His dominance reflected in his stance, and both Rock and I lowered our heads. Remind me to bite him later, I thought, and Rock eyed me and gave a small grunt of laughter. Paige sighed. Well, until then, is there anywhere inside that's large enough for her to work out? Track shrugged. If we clear the hallway down here and she runs straight through, she can lap back and that would make a decent track. The hardwood floors and throw rugs might be an issue. I sighed and laid down, putting my head on my paws. Paige frowned. Having her sit here is not good. She needs to run. Then she crossed her arms and faced the three. Their eyes widened a bit, and I watched Track. He was higher than me in our pack, and I wanted to see who was dominant, but she kept her eyes going back and forth between the vampires. Wow, she was smart. Had she challenged Track, she would have messed with my pack, and things could have gone bad fast. Track looked irritated, but not in a wolf way. He did shoot me a look, and then I barked when he actually stuck his tongue out at me. He knelt in front of me. What's the matter, little doggy pouting? He said in a taunting voice. What are you doing? Jonathan hissed, but Paige put her hand up. More points for her. I sat up. Track shrugged. You can't go play, so just get over it, pup. Oh, it was on now. I barked hard and he stood. She's really not that fast anyhow, he said, and then took off at a hard run. I watched him, still a little stunned by what just happened. Rock barked twice at my side, and Jackson bolted. Track ran towards the changing room, and Jackson slid into it just as he slammed the door. I was antsy now. Rock and I trotted over there, eyeing the door that was now cracked open just a little. A few minutes later, the door pushed open and a brown wolf came out. He nipped at me and then turned and ran across the pool room. The three of us took off after him. We all slid across the tile in places, barking at each other, but we were having fun. Jonathan watched, as did my father. Paige shrugged. I guess this will have to do. Hopefully the area is wolf-proof enough. The two men looked at her, and she shook her head and walked towards the doctors. I slammed into a few walls, trying to run around the corners, until I finally learned how to slow down as I took them. But I was running. We all were. We scared a few maids and three of Dad's council members who happened to be coming around a corner or walking out of a room. Track was in the lead. I was faster, but when I tried to pass him, I got a sharp bark and a nip on my backside that told me I was to follow. He ran upstairs, back down, and through every hall in the manor, which was considerable. Rock tried to pass me at one point, and I pounced on him. We both slid into the wall, yelping. A large statue teetered, and we took off before we heard the crash behind us. Sorry, Dad, I thought. We ran back into the pool room at one point, but Track ran the perimeter. Since it was a huge pool, the surrounding area was considerable. We all slid on the tile again, but he barked happily and kept going. My dad, Jonathan, and Michael were standing near the doctors and Paige. We ignored them, but they watched us tear through the room. I slid and hit a towel rack, shook my head and kept going. Then out back into the hallway we went. We sped past the kitchen, and suddenly I skidded to a halt. I lifted my nose and looked at the double doors that were closed. I heard barking ahead, but that smell had my attention. I looked up at it and barked, and then barked again. The others came back, and Track looked at me. I lifted my nose and sniffed. He turned and did the same. Hungry? I barked again, and he walked up and used his paw to scratch the door. We all waited. Finally the doorknob turned, and a woman stuck her head out. She smiled and opened the door. Just in time, she announced, as if she had been waiting for us. She sat large metal bowls on the floor, and we inhaled the delicious food. I was licking the bowl within seconds. The older woman smiled as she watched us, and I barked at her. I wanted more. Oh, she said, and moved to the huge refrigerator. She peeked in, and I trotted over and sat, waiting. Suddenly, another scent caught my nose. My ears flattened, and a deep growl started in my throat. The woman looked at me, her eyes wide, but I didn't see her. I moved, slowly this time, my body down a bit, and careful not to click my nails on the tile. My lip was pulled back now, and the growl was even deeper. I looked up at the huge picture window that overlooked a large section of one of the gardens. Track was at my side. What is it? I smell human, I hissed, my fur on end and my eyes tight. I put my paws up on the counter and sniffed. Part human, part werewolf. I barked loudly, then again and again. This was my house, my pack, my territory, and I was letting whatever was out there know it. Track snorted. I can't smell it. I should be able to smell the wolf at least. My anger was building, and I didn't hear him. I tried to jump up on the counter to get closer to the window, but I couldn't. I started to pace, turning my head and barking at the unseen threat. Then I trotted to the center of the room and turned. I lunged into a run and jumped. I made it onto the counter, but had too much momentum and crashed into the massive window. Luckily, it was reinforced, and I simply yelped from the impact. I shook myself hard and started to bark at the window. I heard voices behind me and in my mind, but I ignored them all. I wanted whatever was out there. They had invaded my territory, and they were going to pay. A wolf that let others walk on their territory was in for problems. I had to exert my dominance. I had to fight them, or at least put on a good show. I was still barking when I heard Track's sharp bark behind me. I turned and looked down. He had his legs a bit more apart, his hackles were up, and his lip was back. Oops. He shot another hard bark. I took one more look out into the darkness and then jumped down. He was waiting. He circled me until my head and tail dropped. "What are you thinking?" he growled as he paced around me, cowing me into remembering he was higher than I was. "You jumped on the counter, smashing into the window like a dog, Reina." My ears went back on that one. That wasn't very nice. Then we both heard noises outside and turned, my ears picking up quickly. We turned when we heard angry voices behind us. Jonathan and my dad ran in, Michael just behind them. "Put them in the chamber, now," my dad yelled, hitting a button. The whir of the mechanism filled the room, and we saw the metal sheet slide down over the window. Jonathan ran over to Track. "You have to follow me. Make the others come." Track barked and Jonathan turned. Then Track barked at us and we followed him out of the room. We ran down to the end of the hallway and Jonathan did something at a place on the wall. The wall itself slid to one side and my head tilted. Wow, was that always there? Track barked and I jumped and followed them through. I heard other voices but didn't turn. We ran down some steps and came to another door. Again, Jonathan did something, and again the wall opened to allow us in. We finally trotted into an enormous room that was furnished like one of Dad's sitting rooms. There was a large rug in the middle, some couches, nice chairs, a few bookcases, and a desk. There was a TV at one end. I moved over to another partition and looked behind it. Michael walked past me and into the area. He flipped a bunch of switches on a panel, and 12 small computer screens blinked into life on the wall in front of him. He pulled out a stool from under the counter and sat. I looked up at the screens. They showed different places around the manor and grounds. Trax stepped up next to me. He asked me what I knew, and I told him. It was a male, human and wolf hybrid, and older than us. "I have to shift back and call Phil and Ryan," he said, then trotted off. I watched Michael work, and he looked over at me. "They've already caught 3 intruders," he told me, and I walked over next to his leg. He was angry, and I knew it was because those 3 had gotten past the security and were on the manor grounds. He shot me a quick wink. "Not to worry. We know how to deal with their kind." I barked to let him know that I would help if needed. He smiled as he picked up a phone that was attached to the console with the long cord. When I walked back out into the main room, I saw Paige, and she smiled at me. 2 doctors were there as well as 4 of Michael's security force. Rock and Track were back on 2 legs and had towels wrapped around their waist. Jackson was still wolf, and he gave me a small bark. Track was on a cell phone, and Rock was pacing. I barked again to let them know they had caught the people. Track looked at me, and I turned towards the half wall that hid Michael. He walked over to it and told whoever he was talking to hold on. He talked to Michael and then went back to the phone, but stayed there watching the screens. Jonathan sat in a chair and was on his cell phone too. I stayed near Track and Michael, half listening to what they were saying, half guarding them. Finally, Michael stood. "All clear," he grunted, and Track informed the person on the phone. I barked the information to the room, and Jackson barked back. Jonathan stood and walked over. Michael turned. There were 3, with a 4th outside. "We have them all." Jonathan looked down at me, and I snorted and trotted back into the room. Fine, I thought. I'll find out later. That's where I'm going to end this one.